I just wanted to really quickly lay out a few bullet points around sort of key themes we thought about last week so that we can then use that moving forward through what we're going to look at today. The first point I have here, and we whipped through literally 4 centuries of painting. So just to lay out a few key themes. So one of the things we talked about last week was how humans are overwhelmingly present in the first 2 sections of the exhibition. Well into the 18th century, narrative was really a driving force for art. It was very high up in the hierarchy of art making. It was what was valued by artists and collectors alike and contemporaries. So it wouldn't have occurred to many artists to paint without human presence for quite some time. Second point, when I say narrative or storytelling, I mostly mean for that period religion and mythology. Okay, those are the kind of key salient themes that emerge. It takes a while for the depiction of contemporary events to occur in European art. And human presence also defined portraiture and self-portraiture, as we saw last week. And those are, the genre of portraiture is quite well represented in our show. States of dress. So we talked about states of dress and states of undress last week. And, clothing indicates so much when thinking about these paintings. That was our theme for last week. It's a really important way of gauging information about these works, about understanding them, not only in terms of identity of sitters, but also like a social context around them. So that really matters. And artists would draw on tradition and previous iconography when thinking of how to clothe individuals in their paintings. There are certain prescriptive elements in place. The artist doesn't just go, okay, I think I'll paint the Virgin Mary in a purple cloak. There is kind of a prescription around how to present a number of key individuals in both religion and mythology. But when they do deviate from those norms, that is when it gets a bit interesting. And that's a lot of what we do in art history, is think about those deviations. One example of that last week was Caravaggio deviating from how to show an allegory of music. He doesn't have the female figure there. He chooses to show these 4 individuals and present an allegory of music in a different way. So that was one instance that we could think of there. We also looked at fashion as an indicator of social rank or status in portraits. That's very important. Hugo van der Goes, the donor, that is an important motivating factor as well. Okay, so that was all bullet point 3. Now, number 4, states of undress. We are interested in nudity in art, that is a fact. And typically in our religious scenes, this would be something reserved for Christ, some saints such as Saint Sebastian, Adam and Eve, but the majority of times when you see a nude, it will be a mythological figure. So classicism and mythology gave artistic license to depict nudes. It's artists enjoyed flexing their prowess when they, Titian gets to do mythology. I can do some nudes now, and really explore that as a form. And of course, in the show, we lead up to the 19th century, and we see the nude by Courbet, for example, and that practice of painting nudes becomes very important in emergent artistic academies in like the 18th and 19th century, especially in France. Okay, so that's an important point. But back to our sort of early modern mode, remembering that was a world that embraced both the sacred and the secular. So we looked at that painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, where, he's a painter who, without paradox, could paint very reverent and religious scenes for the Reformation, and then, for kind of propaganda for the Reformation. And then at the same time, he depicts the scantily clad scene of the Judgment of Paris. He's, meeting the requests of various patrons. So there's no paradox there. They embraced that sacred and secular. So I think we have to steer clear of thinking of this period as a kind of solely religious context that did not permit more titillating images, if I could use that word, because some of these are sort of racy mythological scenes, particularly if you think of the work by Titian, which would have formed a really important part of entertainment at the Spanish court, gatherings where they'd focus on and reflect upon erotica even. So those are modes that matter in the period as well. So erotica, humor, subversion, they aren't just the realm of contemporary art. They matter in this period as well. So there's a reason we call it the early modern period. A lot of things that we see happening here sort of link up to modern life. Fifth point, and I will move on to images shortly. Just remember, too, that authorship does not mean everything in art history. I think that's a really important point, particularly with this show. Some of the artists may not be familiar to you as, well-promoted individuals of the Renaissance, but that doesn't matter. Authorship does not mean everything. And something I talked about last week as well was that although the Met show is overwhelmingly painted by men, there's only 2 women artists included, this does not absolve or prevent a lens onto women. On the contrary, more than half of the works in the show do feature women, so it's an excellent opportunity to focus on their lives, on their customs, on their dress, especially if we embrace this kind of social history of art, which is very much something contemporary art historians do. We looked at that coral necklace that Silvigia Sassetti was wearing in that Ghirlandaio portrait for a long time. I know I spent a while on it, but that's because it opened up that social history of art lens, also possibilities for thinking about colonialism and trade and the movement of material things, not just paintings, but the things in and of themselves, which points to today's session. Related to that, the lives of lesser-known artists matter as well. So I gave you the example of Davide Ghirlandaio. You'll remember I read that passage from Vasari, and he was the one who attacked the abbot with a loaf of bread. He was angry about the meal that he was served, and he's a minor character in that story, in that life of his more famous brother, but he matters as well. He's percolating in there. Finally, geographies matter, north and south. So you'll remember that the geographies represented, and that I talked about, the geographies represented in this show, in the early parts of the show, are not just Europe. We have Italy, Netherlands, Spain, France, and those nuances matter. None of these painters would have necessarily had a cohesive sense of Europe, even. So, or necessarily some of the nations I just mentioned. The 19th century is the era of nation building. And, just think of Italy today. If you've traveled there, you'll know there's a massive difference between, say, Venice and Naples, or, anywhere on the East Coast. There are such nuances in terms of language and food and customs and everything. And the whole notion of, Italian city-states, it's still kind of alive. You have some Italians who are like, oh, unification, what? They are very protective of all of that. So, and anyone who's traveled in Italy knows that. So those nuances are part of thinking about the art of that period when you go deeper. So art making unfurls differently in those places. Social, political, religious perceptions varied from one city-state to another. And finally, this is the last point before I launch into new things. Thinking about technique, and that's something that came up a few times last week. So this contrast between oil and tempera. And I had some questions at the end asking, for a more nuanced understanding around those things. So I just put together a little summation here that thinking about tempera and why it's different from oil, we have to understand that tempera is this kind of fast-drying painting medium. Pigments are mixed with that water-soluble binder, usually egg yolk, because it's glutinous, and it lasts a long time, it dries fast, it's hard to fix, so it's a quick moving process there. And that was the medium used in antiquity, and then in the 13th, 15th centuries in Italy. But it gets replaced, and in our show, we see that move where oil takes on as the medium of choice. And oil painting, as it develops in the Netherlands, especially with the Van Eyck brothers, involves painting with pigments using different kinds of oils as binding agents. So different oils mean different drying times, different kinds of sheens, different results. And with oils, you can do these glazes and have sheens and layering and make adjustments as you're going along. So that's a very different process and medium than your tempera. And that was something Michael was very cognizant of, Michael Zavros, and that was something we were constantly aware of when we went through that show, thinking about what is it made of and what are the possibilities that can be embraced with the different kinds of painting mediums. So in a show on painting, that's where I encourage that close looking and understanding of those nuances and differences and what is possible with one medium versus another. Okay, and then the broad point there is that by at least, say, the early 15th century in the Netherlands, oil would replace tempera for sure, and canvas eventually would become the replacement for wood as support. What's the difference between canvas and wood? Canvas, you can roll it up. You can move it in a different way. It's not, stretching a canvas, all of that. That's involving that support is very different from a panel, which involves being created in a workshop. You have to make that panel, you have to smooth it out, all of those things. Canvas eventually becomes very widely available. It takes hold as a support, especially in Venice, so in northern Italy, and then eventually it just spreads out and becomes the medium of choice for almost all artists, painters, that is. Okay, some pictures. So today we're shifting gears and moving from states of dress and undress to the lives of things. And I want to think about the following question, when did objects, well, there's a bunch of questions. When did objects become subjects for artists? And, in thinking about the lives of things in this period, we're going to look at things such as globes and skulls and musical instruments, to the rich symbolism of fruits and vegetables, and the emergence of still life as a genre, so as a mode of painting in and unto itself. I'm also fascinated in this Met show by the various animals that populate the scene. So we have beautiful dogs and cats and horses and snakes even taking on pivotal roles. And in one instance, this remarkable fly that once you see it, you can't forget it. And we'll spend some time with that fly today. So moving into this, I love thinking about insects in art, okay? Because you move to this microcosm. Another theme I'll sort of stretch out a bit today is this idea of the microcosm or the microscopic being embraced at the same time as the telescopic. So you can have these sharp lenses in offering this, and then in the background, tiny little things, but those things matter. So the session is about how things matter in our consideration of human, non-human. Well, let's look at those sort of non-human elements and think about how they activate the scenes that they're in. Now, this means to broadly engage with a field of inquiry known as iconography from the outset. So that's basically thinking about the symbolism attached to particular things and creatures, meanings that would have been readily understood in context, and now sometimes require a bit of detective work to understand, because some of our points of reference are no longer the same as our artists and those who would have lived in this time. So as before, for the early parts of the show, the Bible and mythological texts that are being revitalized in this period really are crucial points of reference. So you'll find a lot of art historians combing, and we'll talk about that when we hit the work by Piero di Cosimo, trying to find textual references for a lot of these mythological sources. Oh, surely, artist X was reading this while thinking about creating this scene. And we do have to understand that those literary references, they were sort of commonly held in this period. Like right now, when I teach Renaissance, I can't assume necessarily everyone is aware of the 4 New Testaments and, will have that. And similarly, have they read Homer? Have they read? Those points of reference were assumed then. And so the possibilities for recognition are very much built in there. but actually it gives me something to do and a job to sort of then work on unpacking these things. So I don't mind. And, those are remarkable. You don't need to be religious to find the Bible a point of interest. It is a fascinating text to dive into. I was advocating for reading of Vasari last week. I also advocate for reading of Old and New Testament. There are incredible stories in there, whether, and for those of you who, for whom it is, an accepted belief. I went through Catholic school. I learned a lot about saints. It's very useful to me now as an art historian, I have to say. So if you've asked yourselves any of the following questions, why is there often a skull in crucifixion scenes? Why do some paintings have halos, others don't? How do we identify saints? What is the difference between a satyr and a centaur? Why is a cucumber hanging in one of those paintings? And those questions, you're interested in iconography, okay? You're interested in that symbolism, and that absolutely mattered in this context. Now, a lot of those things that I've just itemized are referred to as attributes. So often particular saints could be identified by the objects or animals that always accompanied them. And probably some of these are familiar to you. Saint Catherine and her wheel, the wheel upon which she was martyred. Saint Sebastian, his many arrows. Saint Jerome and the lion. If you're in a gallery in Europe and you're kind of combing through, you see a lion and a guy reading a book, it's probably Saint Jerome. So those kinds of little indicators of who someone is. And mythological figures as well. So Bacchus and his wine, Apollo and his lyre, Athena and her shield. There are all these indicators that help us to re-immerse in these points of reference that would have been common knowledge in the period. Another point that I want to make here is we have to pay attention to objects that were collected that indicate a broader narrative of economic exchange. I mentioned that last week as a kind of globalism that was emerging in terms of trade. That coral necklace of Silvegia Salsetti. And, objects could be used for gifts or for exchange or valued as mementos or keepsakes. And that's absolutely something we can all relate to. They could form part of encyclopedic collections. And I think art history is really turning, I'm excited about this unit because art history as a discipline really is turning to this kind of more nuanced understanding of things and how they operate in paintings like the ones in the Met Show. There's one art historian, James Elkins, who wrote this whole book called The Object Stares Back, which sounds so ominous, but really thinking about not just the human presence, but the non-human as well. And, that's another lecture, the post-humanist turn and all this stuff, but it impacts thinking about early modern art as well, as much as contemporary. So as we move through the rooms in the Met Show, move through the centuries, we see how objects gradually became subjects for artists, not as appendages or accompaniments or identifiers, but subjects in their own right, and then crucial to very evocative studies of form. So ending with Cézanne's apples today, and thinking about how, they're a great example of this. Those apples are not about Adam and Eve or the Garden of Eden. Those apples are apples in and of themselves, if I could put it that way. So that is kind of the end point that we reach eventually, thinking about the emergence of, the object thriving, literally. Okay, so starting as we did last week in the early zones of the show with a very specific kind of scene here, the crucifixion, so one of the key moments in the Christian faith, and that this is also the oldest work in the show. And last week I talked about how many of the works in the show are very small devotional images, meaning they were intended for personal use, rather than being large-scale altarpieces for churches. So thinking about this term devotional, what do I mean? Well, images were precious in the 15th century. And more than that, they were rigorously contemplated and objects for meditation. And you can imagine this work as central to the faith of a devout follower. So not just a decorative scene, but rather part of one's daily activities and used as a catalyst for faith and thinking and meditating on the mysteries of faith and life. And you remember that quote I read to you last week about images mattered in the Renaissance to the functioning of society and by extension to the lives of individuals who owned them. So the first thing we have to think about is the work of art in and of itself as a thing that's upon which faith is is pivoting. Within such narratives, objects acted as indicators of identity, place, and storytelling, and we have to recall the importance of things in Christian faith. So churches and even cities could be built up around fragments thought to have been associated with Christian figures, and especially Christ. So I have in mind things like a splinter of the cross, the true cross, a drop of Christ's blood, the tongue of St. Anthony. They are all places that are associated with those objects, which we refer to in art history as like the cult of relics. So that privileging of those things as having literal powers for the faithful. Now, on the left here, we have, of course, Fra Angelico's Crucifixion from about 1420. And if I could recommend to you a place to visit in Florence once we get to travel again, it would be the Convent of San Marco, where in these tiny individual and tiny solitary cells, you can see about 50 paintings by Fra Angelico and his assistants. It's a remarkable, viewpoint onto meditative life in the period, and resplendent with works by Fra Angelico and his assistants in fresco. And the point being, that gives you that sense, and being isolated in our rooms is something we now know a bit about from the pandemic and quarantine. So this idea of having this visual as something to meditate upon. And Fra Angelico and his patron actually reserved cells for themselves in the convent as well, because that was part of their devotional practice. It's also worth noting that that convent was run by the Dominican order, which is an order of monks known for very reclusive and solitary and studious activities. But anyway, moving on to the image in the Met show, the crucifixion here, within that context of San Marco, the artist, Fra Angelico is an adopted name. He was originally Guido di Pietro, and he was rechristened Fra Angelico, so literally the angelic friar. And just super briefly, Vasari, he's important here. Listen to Vasari on Fra Angelico. He was most kind and sober, keeping himself free from all worldly ties, often saying that he who practiced art had need of quiet and to be able to live without cares, and that he who represents the things of Christ should always live with Christ. He was never seen in anger by the friars, which is a great thing and seems to me almost impossible to believe. And he had a way of admonishing his friends with smiles. So a very different personality from Davide Ghirlandaio we talked about last week with his anger and throwing things at abbots instead. And that is part of the picture we have around Fra Angelico. He has this prolific workshop. He's producing so many of these kind of small-scale devotional images. This was about servicing spiritual needs. And, this painting here using this gold leaf to create a shimmering background, a literal interpretation of the heavenly realm that dominated most devotional images of the medieval period, a lingering here of that kind of earlier sense that to indicate heaven, you used gold to do so. And this is definitely one of the works you should go and look at very carefully for yourselves. We see traditional crucifixion iconography here. Halos for the most important figures. Christ, obviously indicated. The fainting Virgin, the three Marys in the foreground, and the young St. John right there at the far left. These are figures you will see present in almost every crucifixion scene. We can identify them with regularity. Now, behind them is this diverse gathering. Notice the turbans, the helmets, the hats. It's kind of indicators of a multiculturalism, in fact, and different professions. And there's a beautiful close-up in the catalog, which you should buy, because the catalog has these incredible close-ups, and you can pick up on details in there that you can't see necessarily from this slide, but I was noticing different things I hadn't really noticed before. Every tiny detail is rendered palpable. I was especially struck by the bits and the bridle on the horses. But then this soldier on the far right here, you can't quite see it here, but his gloves are hanging there. His gloves have been removed. His sword is red, as is one of his gloves. And it's likely that that's Longinus, a character we know inflicted the last of the 5 holy wounds on Christ. So Longinus is from the Greek for lance. So this is what I mean about things mattering. Things people are carrying matter and indicate to us identities. He was a Roman soldier or bystander. Oh, sorry, moving on to another character here. And I do have a laser pointer, so I'm going to actually use it. So this was the figure I was just talking about. And then here, right underneath, sort of, in this incredible pose, looking up, we have Stepharton, who was a Roman bystander or soldier who offered Christ a sponge soaked in vinegar. You can see here. At the crucifixion, you can look at his clothing. He's dressed really simply. You can even see curly chest hair there. The detail is extraordinary. And that is what I mean by things matter. We know who people are because of what they're holding. It's a very simple point. I mean, I'm also struck here by these angels with cups, trying to catch every precious drop of blood that is coming down. And then you notice the blood streaming all the way down here and coming to this skull. And that's very important as well. The skull is about to be drenched in blood. That's the skull of Adam, the first man. So Adam prefigures Christ. The spot where Christ is crucified was sometimes thought to be where Adam was buried. And you'll see that skull again and again. You see it here in our lamentation as well. So that, again, these things, and later we'll look at a skull as an indicator of melancholy. And, as I said, the scene's meaning, in fact, pivoting in part upon inanimate objects. So that's really important. Now, on the right with this Petrus Christus image, I do want you to notice one other thing. Sorry, I've got hair falling. What I'd like you to notice there are these objects here in the far right. Now, you see some nails, and you can sort of put 2 and 2 together and think, okay, those are the nails. But what's extraordinary here is the inclusion of the objects used to remove the nails from the cross. So we call those secondary relics because they aren't as directly associated with Christ. But I can tell you that they mattered. And in the north in particular, you see entire woodcuts dedicated to showing with exactitude what all those instruments of the Passion looked like. So all the things linked up with Christ being crucified, the moment leading up to that. So the whip, the column on which he stood while he was being whipped, the nails, the splinter of the cross in and of itself. So all of these things become absolutely crucial elements to various churches and spots of devotion throughout Europe in this period. And here they're being detailed with extraordinary precision. They aren't secondary, they're important to the scene, to an understanding of the scene. And as I said, I can sort of attest to various woodcuts and depictions of those instruments of the Passion beyond the painted tradition. So they become objects of veneration in their own right, but they also become the objects of study with these drawings and sketches and prints and woodcuts all showing them in their form. So that's important. I won't linger there because we talked about this work last week as a really important having an important emotive response. I think I use the phrase drapery as an agent of feeling. That's one of my favorite phrases. I use it all the time. But it is, seeing the matching curves of the Virgin and Christ there and giving the Virgin Mary that pivotal role in the narrative. And of course, the halos are gone. There's a naturalistic Flemish landscape. There's people in contemporary dress. So that's quite different from our Fra Angelico work. And you can see right there a transition that's happening. Okay, now, my favorite, I really, having this here in Brisbane is amazing. Carlo Crevelli. We looked at this work very briefly last week. To my mind, this is one of the most complex and utterly fascinating works in the show. Crevelli is a painter who did almost exclusively religious subjects. Vasari does not mention him in the Lives. There's a bit of a Florentine bias in a lot of what Vasari does, but Crevelli's career was in Venice, Padua, the Dalmatian coast. He traveled around a lot. We know that in the 1460s, he was actually banished from Venice for committing adultery. He abducted a married woman. So those are the kinds of details we know about him. Now, when he died, his reputation really declined. And, for a long time in art history, he was seen as a second-rate painter, which is absolutely rubbish. One scholar describes him as spending 5 centuries languishing on the margins of art history. And in scholarship, I've seen the words parochial, conservative, decorative, and decadent used with Crevelli. And also this idea of a hybrid style was frowned upon for a long time. It was seen in an almost derogatory way in 20th, 21st century scholars. They are all wrong. This is all wrong. Once you look at Crevelli, it is hard to forget. And we all know this fly. We can't take once we fixate with the way the Virgin and Child are fixated on that fly, we find it hard to tear our eyes away as well. So things to notice here include, the looming and majestic figures in the foreground, the detailed background landscape, and contrast those figures in the foreground to these tiny turbaned figures walking there. Testament to Venice at its position at the site of trade routes, not just north and south, but east and west as well. So the impact of the Ottoman Empire there is something a lot of Venetian scholars spend a lot of time thinking about. And that's what I mean by that microscopic and telescopic at the same time. We get both views in one picture here, which is amazing. But today we're here to talk about things, and there are many things here that catch our eye, starting with those oversized fruit and veg. And yes, that is a giant cucumber, but also that hanging fabric there that seems to hang from nothing, the hard-edged ornament of the mother and child's halos, encrusted with jewels and these busy and richly decorated fabrics. Even for me, a point of interest is down here, this terracotta molding. It's done with extraordinary realism. One characterization of Crevelli is hallucinatory precision. It's just, so you kind of can linger and revel in the precision going on here. And then, of course, that fly that you can almost hear buzzing in the scene. Starting up top and thinking about this disproportionate scale given to the cucumber and apples. I mean, he obviously wants to draw some attention there. They seem to be a very close thing into our own world, breaking kind of walls of illusionism, blurring the line between us and giving this window onto this world. The apple is quite simple. We can take that to symbolize original sin, the source of our fall, the forbidden fruit that Eve bit into. The cucumber, slightly more complex and quite idiosyncratic. Some scholars have suggested that the cucumber is a symbol of resurrection and redemption. Others suggest that apples symbolize female sin and cucumbers symbolize male sin, given their shapes. So I'll leave that to you to figure out. Regardless, the cucumber was absolutely Crevelli's signature motif. He almost always included it in his garlands. It's like a stamp of this is Crevelli, this is Crevelli. So those idiosyncrasies are really important to think about. Letting our eyes comb over the surface a bit more, this swath of fabric, it's a particular kind of fabric called moire, which is a rippled textile and a patterned silk created when pressing of layers of textile when wet. And you can see the sort of patterning that's emerged there has a very subtle, delicate pink hue here with broad spacing. You can even see that it's been folded. And that makes me think of being in Venice and seeing the linen hanging out over the canals, It's such a Venetian picture. Then even like the contrasts between the fabric here. I mean, Christ on this kind of dimple and prickled pillow, and that folded. This is a piece of paper that's been folded up, and here it is unfolded and furled. So that is what I mean by hallucinatory precision, or that rigorous attention to detailed and illusionism. The goldfinch clutched by Christ here is quite simple to explain. The goldfinch as an emblem of purity, a very popular pet in this period and a bringer of good health. But of course, that gaze of the Madonna and Child on that fly, which kind of disturbs the serenity of the scene. Now, flies have long associations with sin, death, rot, evil, corruption, pestilence. You'll see them with decaying fruit. And they're considered to be evocative of the transience of human life. So the fact that life is impermanent. Even Christ will face death, and that is an indicator here as that fly disturbs that very scene. If you think of Book of Exodus, the swarm of flies as punishment, or there's a really wonderful poem by Emily Dickinson where she says, it starts, I heard a fly buzz when I died. So that link to, and we think of flies buzzing around carcasses and flesh and things like that. So it has very negative connotations, and here it's sort of disturbing that scene. We also can sort of make a nice art history reference here. Vasari tells the story of Giotto painting a fly to fool his teacher Cimabue. So they're painting away in their studio. Cimabue goes for a coffee break or something. Giotto is there, paints this fly onto a scene, and Cimabue comes back and looks at the painting and the fly, he tries to swat it off, and Giotto's there laughing or whatever. But that point being that the illusionism created was so perfect that it fooled the teacher Cimabue. So you will see flies coming up in a lot of early modern paintings as that point of reference. So there can be more than one meaning associated to these things, so kind of duality. Literally that reference to death, but also an indicator of the painter's capacity to fool the eye, a trompe-l'oeil effect. So that's really, really important. Okay, so this is perfect for a session called Human, Non-Human, actually. We have the enigmatic and very strange Piero di Cosimo with his hunting scene, and absolutely a work that has perplexed many art historians. And those are the erudite kind of picture puzzles that we love to sink our teeth into, and, allowing for multiplicity of, because when I'm teaching, I often find my students want me to say, this is what it means. Well, sometimes it can mean more than one thing. You can have that plurality, and that was advocated for and accepted in the period. So do yourselves a huge favor, go into the show, let your eyes roll and linger over this beauty. A forest full of satyrs, so half man, half goat, and there's centaur in the background, half man, half horse, and various animals all engaged in acts of violence and aggression as they flee a fire that is engulfing the background forest. So it's almost 15th century eco-criticism. It's sort of, we can think about links for ourselves, thinking about bushfires and what happens then. So this is a thematic that's alive for our friend Piero di Cosimo. And my first impression with him is always, I've never seen anything like this. There's a singularity about these works that is really extraordinary. And with Piero, it's as if many of the rules of iconography just get thrown out the window. So again, we are super lucky to have this here. It is, as a Renaissance scholar, I couldn't believe that this was one of the, I'm very, very happy to see this. So there's not much else that looks like his work. There are very few visual points of comparison, and it's in fact contemporary literary texts that offer the best clues to interpretation. So we have that tension of, is he drawing on past traditions? Is he a full-blown innovator? Again, a little of both. And as I said, that literary tradition really matters here. So a very erudite kind of picture. And like Crevelli, art historians are still trying to figure out things about Piero di Cosimo. Recall last week that I told you that, labels are your friends, dimensions matter, and this is clearly a very horizontal image, and it helps art historians to figure out the function of things. So Piero is known for working on spaliere, which are these horizontal paintings designed to hang above furniture or could be set into home decor. So from the horizontal thrust, we know this was part of a home decor of a secular setting, but what is he showing us? Okay. As I said, puzzling, erudite, and I think, there's an art historian, Erwin Panofsky, who some of my students love to hate, but he is absolutely critical to thinking through how Piero works, and he's Panofsky is sort of a god of iconography. He spent his whole career thinking through relationships between images and texts of the period. So an erudite thinker and art historian in his own right. And he makes literary connections with the Roman poet Lucretius, but also Vitruvius. And these are two important first century Roman writers, who I will get to a little bit more in a second. But let's just think about what we're looking at. That background fire forcing all those woodland creatures into the open. You have bears, lions, boar, deer, cattle. There's even a monkey, and you're like, what? Do these animals actually coexist? They're fleeing the flames, creatures which actually don't coexist. We have some sense that this is of another time and place, not quite our present moment. These horrible acts of violence as hunters, satyrs, and a centaur slaughter and savage the animals. Now, satyrs and centaurs, I mean, they are inherited from classical antiquity, but never like this. This is a very different engagement with them. And so we can sense that Piero's it's kind of an imagined universe. I should note, though, that Piero was known for taking part in various civic festivals in Florence where, because remember last week I mentioned, it's not just visual culture or paintings we have to think about when we contemplate 15th century Florence. It's also, they loved parades and processions and, exhibiting living statues in the moment, people dressed up as things. And satyrs were part of some of these entertainments. And also that point, that humor and thinking beyond like a super serious context. They enjoyed these dabbling in those kinds of other realms as well. Now, so that's just to say a satyr is something that would have been familiar to our 15th century view, but not quite like this. And so when we see a scene like this, it is natural to seek a frame of reference, which is what a bunch of art historians did, as I mentioned, especially Panofsky. No one is creating in a vacuum. And he sought out textual sources that could help him to understand what Piero and his contemporaries were thinking about here, to tap into potential meanings for such a scene. So, from the Roman poet Lucretius from the 1st century, in The Nature of Things, Book 5, there is a description of early humankind's primitive history. It has nothing to do with paradise. It's a very somber, horrific scene, just as you see here. And Lucretius seeks to give a kind of account of the origins of the world and to characterize what it was like, the early history of man, and later the advent of civilization. So I'll just read you a quick quote from that. He says, "Humans dwelling in the woods and forests and mountain caves hid their rough bodies in the underwoods, and by the aid of their wonderful powers of hand and foot, they would hunt the woodland tribes of beasts with volleys of stones and ponderous clubs." He's imagining deep history, deep time, like a primitive past that, he can link up to his present. So, and for Lucretius, the pandemonium created by the wildfire is like the wild beast, to be tamed for its comfort and civilizing potential. So this is sort of an imagining of pre-civilization, if you will. Another possible source that Panofsky talks about is Vitruvius, who's really famous for these books he writes about architecture, also in the 1st century. And in there, he traces the origins of civilization to the discovery of fire. So fire matters. Here's a quote from Vitruvius. "The men of old were born like the wild beasts in woods, caves, and groves, and lived on savage fire. As time went on, the thickly crowded trees in a certain place, tossed by storms and winds, and rubbing their branches against one another, caught fire, and so the inhabitants of the place were put to flight, being terrified by the furious flame." So that's really evocative as well. So in text and in paint, these attempts to imagine a sort of primitive past. We also need to acknowledge something really important that's going on concurrently with Cosimo's paintings, that the European exploration of the Americas is happening. This is on people's minds. So imaginings and rumors of the so-called New World, that's what they called it then, the New World, to give visualizations of what they imagined that you could find there, early human histories that would have extra currency in this kind of moment. What did a primitive society look like is something you can imagine Piero and his contemporaries thinking about. So, and, this shows you the erudition of people like Panofsky. He's like, I've found a letter that was read out on the streets of Florence about Amerigo Vespucci in America, and Piero probably heard it and, was thinking about this. So there's a lot that goes into an exhibition catalog being able to say, we link this up to the poet Lucretius. That's the effort. That's a lot of hard work by art historians that goes into making those kinds of links. That's, I think, really important to acknowledge. Vasari, of course, our Vasari, who you should read, absolutely, describes him in really colorful ways too. He says, Piero di Cosimo, an eccentric, terrified of thunderstorms, living more like a beast than a man. Another comment, he says, he was very varied and original in his discourse, and sometimes said such beautiful things that he made his hearers burst with laughter. But when he was old and near the age of 80, he had become so strange and eccentric that nothing could be done with him. I mean, so right there you have, and that reading has lingered with every art historian who says something about Piero di Cosimo cannot resist but to quote Vasari, because we do feel like there is a strange personality lurking behind this, don't we? And, Piero di Cosimo's pupil was Jacopo Pontormo, who's this very interesting mannerist artist. And, there's this whole, stream of art historians who like to think about melancholy. I am one of them. This idea of melancholy in art and thinking about Piero as a potential melancholic who sort of has strange, very different ideas, a bit depressed, thinking about grim. This is a grim scene. So those two artists kind of appearing in a lot of literature that we find around melancholy as early instances of the link with melancholy. And I will say more about melancholy in a little bit. Okay, other paintings in the show allow us to really think, perhaps a bit less dramatically, about our relationship with the animal world. And I keep saying I love these paintings, but I actually do. I really was thrilled to see a work by Carracci and also this Veronese work that we looked at very briefly with Michael Zavrost last week. So here we have, thinking of our timeline here and thinking of this moment, this emergence of new genres, new approaches and subjects for art that are emerging. And the late 16th, early 17th century, you're going to find this surge, particularly in the Dutch Republic, of attention to animal pieces and fruit and veg isolated into and unto itself. And that's new genres emerging. And Annibale Carracci, with this work, seen as an important precursor to that. So new genres opening up for art, still life, landscape, more secular works emergent, not always to do with religion or mythology. Some are allegories, some are portraits, but they very much do pivot on an understanding of animal behavior as much as human behavior. So I won't linger too long here, but just to say, Annibale Carracci he's a contemporary of Caravaggio's, who we looked at last week, and time has not been as kind to Annibale Carracci in that you do tend to find if people want to choose a favorite Roman Baroque artist, they'll gravitate a little more towards Caravaggio, and he's the one who's well known, especially because of his biography. But I can tell you as an art historian in context, Annibale Carracci mattered as much as, perhaps more than Caravaggio, and he was as innovative in his approaches as Caravaggio was. And in some instances, we know Caravaggio actually learned things from what Annibale Carracci had done. And this is a great example of that because this is not representative of Annibale Carracci's large-scale, very heavily patronized works. He did a lot of massive commissions, very well known for public works, I suppose, in Baroque Rome. Here is this really modest work that's literally pivoting on thinking about how is this cat going to react to this evil, not evil, but like this kind of mischievous behavior of these children? Like, who dangles a crawfish in front of a cat? Well, you're asking for it. And that's why we think, okay, there is a bit of an allegorical moral message here. It's like, let sleeping dogs lie, let good enough lie. Why are you doing this, children? You know, someone is about to burst into tears. So especially the young girl here who has this kind of, almost, you can imagine hearing her cackle or some, like the cat, and that cat getting ready to sort of pounce. Now, this work also we can read into a tale told to us by Vasari. Another reference that would have been known to art lovers familiar with Vasari's lives. And Annibale Carracci, if anything, was this studious, like he knew his art history. He was very conscious of building upon past accomplishments of artists like, Michelangelo especially. He revered Michelangelo. And he had, of course, a copy of Vasari's lives. He would have been very familiar with the different tropes in there. So the one I mentioned about Cimabue and Giotto, this kind of thing. And there's a particular story in Vasari's lives that is linked up to this image. The artist who I mentioned last week, without showing any images by her, Sofonisba Anguissola. In Vasari's life of Sofonisba, this woman artist, he mentions that Michelangelo was shown one of her drawings of a child laughing. He admired it and then said a real challenge would be to show a child crying. And Sofonisba, responds with a drawing of one of her sisters offering her infant brother a basket of crayfish, one of which is pinching the boy. Now, this may seem like such a remote reference, but remember what I said earlier. These guys knew their art history. They're cognizant of all these stories. And anyway, the point of that drawing by Sofonisba, inspired by Michelangelo, was that she was able to show the girl laughing and the boy crying. So she's got both emotions in there. So Sofonisba is responding to Michelangelo, but goes one step further, including both a crying and a laughing figure. Look at me, I can do both. It's thought Annibale, because the use of the crayfish is so strange, that Annibale is here referencing that story, okay? Yes, a hugely sort of like intricate link there, but absolutely one that is advocated throughout the literature. And a suggestion, as I said, of Annibale Carracci, like consciously inserting himself in that tradition and simultaneously, almost single-handedly inventing this new genre of painting. The kind of things we saw Caravaggio doing last week, those figures pushed in the foreground, the attention to street figures, everyday individuals. We see that here as well. So really important to understand him as a huge, major figure in Baroque painting. Now on the right are Paolo Veronese, and I really quickly wanted to say a few things about this in our discussion around animals and animal behavior. And Veronese, of course, is another one of these giants of, in this case, particularly Venetian art, along with Titian and Tintoretto, one of the best known of those. It's almost like a trio of painters. And we talked about this work very briefly last week. I mentioned that early modern shift towards like the revealing of men's legs and how initially that was scandalous and associated with the nobility, very much so. Listen to thinking about clothes for 1 second, which, as we did last week. The description is tightly buttoned doublet, balloon-shaped trunk, matching codpiece, stockings, soft flat shoes, restrained, an elegant palette with pinstripe and black and gold chevrons and the black and gold white stripes in contrast. He's sporting a gold chain. His sword is suspended. You can just, again, thinking back to last week, do a whole analysis around the fashion on display here. Something that I didn't mention, I think, was this what's called bombast in the period. And this is literally this kind of padding and stiffening used to create distinctive and fashionable shapes. And in this instance, those pumpkin kind of breeches are using this sort of stiffening and this idea that there were specific intentions around that and how to show that. What I started thinking about too when I was looking at this was, that saying that you start, owners and pets start to look alike. Like, I just started contemplating also just the elegance of that greyhound and how that's central to thinking about the fashion as well, just that posturing. And, then I went down this rabbit hole thinking about this idea of the stiffening and the bombast. And there's really interesting 16th century descriptions of people having so much of it that they couldn't even really bend over. Like, it's just so stiff and set up and elegant and almost defying of comfort. And I started thinking about this with our Paolo Veronese painting. The textual reference is called Masculinity Sheathed and Stiffened. I must tell Michael Zavros about it because I think he'll be quite interested in that. Suffering for fashion and this kind of thing. But anyway, but arguably here, I think what I mostly wanted to say today in this human, non-human section is that the greyhound matches its owner for that elegance. And the greyhound is a really important character in lots of Venetian paintings. It is said to represent nobility and fidelity, and there are textual references for this. So Cesare Ripa's book on iconography, Iconologia, says, the dog is the most faithful animal in the world, beloved by men. So this is taken incredibly seriously in the period, and the greyhound in particular as an indicator of, high social status. Van Dyck painted them, Tiepolo painted them, and the greyhound was in fact a favorite Tudor beast. So in England, you see them appearing in coats of arms, as emblems, in tombs, all kinds of things. So animating that greyhound and thinking about him, I think Chris Sains mentioned this to me, you could do a whole study of just the animals in this show and thinking about the pivotal roles they play. So I think that's a really important element we needed to look at in addition to the clothing from last week. Okay, and speaking of animals playing pivotal roles, here's a great example, another animal activating the image. Guido Kanyachi, for another Italian Baroque painter, very eccentric, another eccentric and strange painter whose works always strike as very deeply modern, in fact, when we look at them. He spent time in the academy that Annibale Carracci established in Rome, so that earlier artist we looked at, and was interested in that, but they also say that he wasn't so interested in creating drawings for the work, so preparatory drawings, and like Caravaggio, was interested in working straight onto the canvas. So that's an important point with him. This, again, speaks to a few things. The idea of the nonconformist artist, we see that simmering through here. Kanyachi often described as being as nonconformist in his life as in his art. He attempted to elope with the widow of a very prominent family. This was a story known about him. Had a lot of affairs. He was reported to have been accompanied in his travels by a woman dressed as a man. So that's a really interesting fact to know about him. And he had to sort of leave various cities where he, so like Caravaggio in life as much as in the choices made around painting. So he created a lot of these sort of half-length compositions for the market, for the art market, often featuring women in states of undress. And you've learned and you know that usually means it's going to be a mythological figure. And in fact, that's exactly the case with much of his oeuvre. And this subject derives from Plutarch, that's the textual reference we have, his Lives, and shows Cleopatra's suicide by an asp, so the snake there, following the defeat of her beloved Mark Antony and his subsequent death. So this was a fairly popular subject in the 17th century, but I suppose the degree to which Kanyachi is engaging with especially women, especially these mythological women. Lucretia is another example of someone he loved to paint. So here we have those motives of sensual realism, an erotic element, again, possible because of the subject matter, again, possible by that snake being that indicator that this is, Cleopatra, rather than a portrait of someone he knows. You see what I'm saying? So that snake is enabling, again, that classical link and enabling the exploration of erotic elements in art. Okay, before I do that, this, because, the snake here, we have another snake in the Vermeer painting, although being smashed and destroyed in the foreground. And just very quickly, what I want to kind of contrast here is to say, here in this 17th century Netherlandish context, we have this kind of very polarizing, disparate, you couldn't pick two scenes that are more different. And that makes them a little bit worth comparing. And the way that things animate this, in the Vermeer things, even with that killing of the snake in the foreground by the big tome representative of the church, there's an order there. With Jan Steen, this disorder. So let's think a little bit about, how that works. And this tender and very precious painting by Vermeer. Of course, you probably know Vermeer. There are very few works by his hand that have been attributed to him. So only about 30 pictures or so firmly attributed to him. This one is unlike anything in his oeuvre. You probably know his Girl with the Pearl Earring or the letter, people opening letters and things. And so this is heavy with allegory. We know this. And we know that when public celebrations of the Catholic Mass were forbidden in the Dutch Republic, you had a lot, and Vermeer converted to Catholicism after his marriage. And we know here he is drawing on this complex language of allegory, using the objects as indicators to offer up a kind of testament to his faith, which he had to celebrate in private. And I love this tapestry drawn back to reveal this, you often see in Baroque art curtains drawn back like in a theatrical way to reveal a scene. And here it's like a revealing of a kind of subversive practice for the period. And for many of the allegorical motifs, and in order to indicate what this is, Vermeer would have used Cesare Ripa's emblem book, and the woman and the globe, so she represents the Catholic faith. She's wearing white, a symbol of purity, and the hand raised to the heart as an indicator of living faith, and her foot on that globe, again, published to illustrate Ripa's description of faith as the world under her feet. So there is, again, this textual reference we can use to understand the significance of objects in this work. And there in the foreground, that cornerstone of the church, Christ represented by that tome, the Bible, crushing the serpent of evil. Nearby, there's an apple. We know what apples mean. Standing for original sin. And then you have that table there transformed into an altar with the chalice and crucifix and another Bible. Also, this glass sphere, look at that in the show. I mean, the painting there is extraordinary and gets us thinking about reflections and, shimmering surfaces in glass. That was a very popular decorative curiosity in the period, and it could be viewed as a symbol of heaven or God. So a very sober, chaste, incredibly painted scene, totally worth your time to head back into the show and have another look and think about the importance of objects for delivering that meaning. Now, Jan Steen, on the other hand, and I love showing these contrasts to my students because it's sort of like, here in the Dutch Republic, you do have that sacred and secular, absolutely, smashed up, for you to see. The Jan Steen, this irreverent kind of jocular scene, contemporaneous, these are almost, they're 16, they're almost painted at the same time. So you have very different worlds in one place happening. So those nuances absolutely matter. And that very different scene with Jan Steen, a self-deprecating depiction of his own unruly household. And my Dutch friend assures me, she said, that the phrase "a household by Jan Steen" is still used to this day as an indicator of a messy house. So don't come over, it's Jan Steen in there. So very much kind of, he paints countless scenes like this, the unruly kind of, I also, lots of scenes of people enjoying drinks and eating and reveling and carousing and so on and so forth. So there's all of that going on. And I mostly, and the objects in disarray, this kind of upside down urn, indicating the chaos of the household. I think that's the main thing I wanted to indicate there and contrast it with the Vermeer. Okay, and I promised to talk about melancholy, and that's, I will sort of hone in on that, because I think that it's really important for us to, in thinking about objects, to really think about, well, here we have two skulls that are absolutely activating our understanding of these paintings, the kind of, and the emergence of the memento mori, or, the reminder of our mortality is a strong theme that comes through in the show with these two very extraordinary works. And, we're getting to heavy stuff now. We're going to end on a downer. I'm sorry, everybody. I should have probably ended with the Jan Steen, but no. We're going to end with focusing on and thinking about our own mortality. And, that was part of why. So back there I have tucked in, let's just talk about the ambassadors in 1 minute. But the reason this is there in part, and with this wonderful work by Holbein that's in the show, as leading into, obviously this is not part of the show, the ambassadors, but I wanted to linger on it for a bit and talk about this skull in the foreground as a kind of, this strange illusionistic skull, which neither of the individuals in the portrait can see, but this propels us forward to thinking about melancholy and illusionism and trompe-l'oeil and the position that you have to be in fact, to identify this as a skull. I mean, the ambassadors is like the Mona Lisa. When you go to London to the National Gallery, there is always a crowd in front of it, and rightfully so. And the other thing I just wanted to highlight quickly was this kind of gathered still life here. Again, another indicator of what's to come in terms of things in and of themselves being objects for study. And you don't have to wait for Cézanne until that. You can see that right here. The celestial objects, the terrestrial objects gathered together, a kind of presentation of all aspects of human endeavor as a still life right there. So, and of course, this deeply enigmatic and strange skull in the foreground. So that propels us to thinking about skulls and how they matter as things in art, and the whole concept of melancholy, of course, which gets associated with artists as their modus operandi. You're depressed, you're an artist, that's how you work. And that has its roots right here with painters like Salvatore Rosa, Pieter Claes, Albrecht Dürer, of course. So if you catch me after one of these sessions, somebody just ask me about Melancholia and Albrecht Dürer, and I'll probably talk your ear off for way too long. But we did a whole exhibition about it at the UQ Art Museum. But within the context of our show, again, and the Salvatore Rosa painting is fabulous, not only as a study in melancholy. I mean, he's basically writing on the skull. I have the exact quote here: "Behold, wither eventually." So eventually we will all die. Kind of, this is the message here. And crumpled on this sheet of paper, he's written a testimonial to his friend. He's written an actual statement saying, this is a kind of indication of true friendship with a particular individual called Giovanni Battista Ricciardi, and he was a man of letters. And so this is a kind of friendship picture in which Salvatore Rosa is reflecting on mortality. He's also indicating his fondness of his friend. He's reflecting on Seneca, who is a Roman writer who talks a lot about friendship and death and all these ponderous themes. And so Salvatore Rosa here presenting himself as this kind of philosophical, melancholic figure. Now that is going to carry through. We could do a whole, I keep saying this, but we could do a whole lecture on thinking about that as a trope in art and art history. And our Pieter Claes work, of course, that now we have that isolation out of those elements. They are just things in and of themselves. They can have an allegorical intent, but they're also a study in precision of depiction. The Dutch loved this 17th century, reveling in contrasting surfaces and textures and things. And sometimes you can look and think, these things don't have anything to do with each other, but they do. They're brought together for reasons. They're sort of itemizing different aspects here of learning and thinking, and then you put a skull on top of it. Yeah, you can learn all you want, but this is going to happen. So I don't know why I'm smiling while I say that, because it is quite a grim lesson to be taken away from it. And this is absolutely one of my favorite works in the show. It matters when I think it was used as the sort of emblem image for the art history course in and of itself for a good reason. And just, again, Chardin, this is another painting worth your time. And Chardin, in fact, he very rarely painted human figures. So this is an extraordinary work for us to have here. But again, we have that focus on like a simple soap bubble becoming a subject of study. And that has always been linked by art historians with transience as well. And Chardin did a few images of soap bubbles. In fact, he's known to have submitted for his first salon hang an image like this. But he excelled in things. Chardin excelled in depicting things. We could look at a whole sequence of works by him where he's just studying things in and of themselves. And that is an emergent theme for the rest of the show, of course. So these two works I had here for thinking about children and childhood and toys, and things don't just matter to adults, but to children as well. And then, of course, leading through to something like Cézanne's apples. And what does my timer? Sorry, everybody. That's awful. Okay. Just very quickly, a quote from Cézanne, and then I'll let you go. He says, "With an apple, I want to astonish Paris," right? And he succeeded. So you could draw a really nice bow from the Crevelli work we looked at the beginning with the apples and the cucumbers pushing into our face. But we have all this other stuff going on. We have all this other stuff to think about, the iconography. Now it's just the fruit pushed into our zone, a study in form, a kind of idea that these apples, we don't need to think about the Virgin Mary anymore. We are thinking, or Eve rather, we are thinking here about the fruit in of themselves and their form and pushing into our space and, sitting there in a very evocative way. So that is my end point here because, and I guess the whole point of this lecture is things matter and these objects matter and they matter to our artists.